This is brought to you by the George Jackson Grassroots Collective, a progressive organization in the new African independence movement that cultivates revolutionary transfer culture, liberating the minds through awareness and education, protecting and training our people while fostering unity as stated in the Code of Umoja. Welcome to the George Jackson Grassroots Collective Dialogue Session.
This is a dialogue with the George Jackson Grassroots Collective and Brother Akil Abara of the Republic of New Libya. Peace, brother. How you doing?
Free the land, comrade. I'm doing all right.
First, I would like to ask, what is the Republic of New Libya, and could you go into some of the brief history?
So the Republic of New Libya, as it stands in the 1960s during the Black Liberation Movement, was what most Black nationalists named their cities after African countries, specifically, ironically enough, Islamic countries, African Islamic countries. So Cleveland called themselves New Libya, and then it was also having ties to the Republic of New Africa as well, which caused the idea of Cleveland having possibility of having some form of sovereignty. And to go further into the history, there was an organization that existed at that time called the Republic of New Libya, led by Fred Ahmed Evans. And he ended up, to kind of give a brief story, when Carl Stokes, the first Black mayor of a major city, was elected, he ended up creating grants for the Black nationalists, because if it wasn't for the Black nationalists in Cleveland, Carl Stokes would have never gotten elected, and he needed the backing of the nationalists. Ahmed Evans and his group, the Republic of New Libya, with the funds spent it on firearms and planning rebellions in other cities to all tie into one big rebellion, a true takeover in some form of fashion against the police department. And then it kicked off July 23rd, 1968 in the Glenville area of Cleveland. And at that point in time, it marked one of the few occasions, at this point, the only occasion, where there were more cop casualties in a Black rebellion, what they were called riot, than Black casualties. So the Republic of New Libya, now as it stands, is specifically wherever Black people lay their heads at in Ohio. It's called New Libya. Specifically Cleveland, but it reigns to all of Ohio. It's called New Libya. Like the Black community in Dayton is called New Libya. The Black community in Cleveland is called New Libya. The Black people in Toledo are called New Libya. You know, it extends to all of Ohio, but it originated in Cleveland, Ohio.
I'm hearing also that with Fred Ahmed Evans and the influence of the Republic of New Libya in Cleveland, that there was also an array of various different lounges, bookstores, and eateries that catered to the revolutionary culture and cultural renaissance of new African ideology. I was told that this had a relationship to Afroset. Is Afroset and the Republic of New Libya two different things? And this actually happened in Cleveland.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, because every time I talk to people outside Cleveland about the history of the Black Liberation Movement, Cleveland is a very interesting story, because Cleveland's Black Liberation Movement was very different than other cities' liberation movement. So Afroset and the Republic of New Libya are two different things. Afroset was started by Hillel Jones, or Hillel X. He ended up picking up the name Jones later in his life. I'll get to that in a minute. With Sababa Akili, who was still around, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence for the Republic of New Africa. He still is with us. And Omar Majid. They started Afroset shortly after 1966 Tough Rebellion, another Black area in Cleveland. Afro Set was a group of a mix of the influence of the Black Panther Party and the US organization. So the full name was Afro Set for Self-Defense because Sababa Akili and Omar Majid, if I'm correct, had traveled from Cleveland to California, and they met with Bunchy Carter. Oh man, what's the other brother's name? John Huggins, those brothers in that section of the Panther Party, and then Ron Karinga. And they wanted to bring something back from that trip to Cleveland. And that's where they got the mix of self-defense, where they added it to their name from the Black Panther Party at that time, in the cultural context of the US organization, with the drum circles and all the big African boom that happened after their trip to California, which was already there, but it influenced it to be more militant at that point. And then and then to get into the lounges, Afro Set had, I think, they had a few. They had almost 3 centers throughout Huff. And it was particularly on East 79th, one off of East. I might get a lot of these addresses wrong, but just know I'm kind of trying to guess off the top of my head. And East 85th. And these were community centers where they organized off of. And then you had Superior, where the Nation of Islam resided, and they had multiple bakeries, foods, and things like that. And then they also shared the same block with the Republic of New Libya, which was a bookshop. And this was all happening at the exact same time, where at this point in Cleveland, all of Cleveland were Black nationalists. None of them were like Black Marxists or Black anarchists. They all were majority. They were all Black nationalists. They all believed in Black nationhood. They may have all had different takes of what it looks like, but they were all Black nationalists. If that answers your question, yeah, there were multiple, and Republic of New Libya and Afro Set are 2 totally different groups. That kind of started. Afro Set started first, and then the Republic of New Libya came, I'll say, a year later, if not a few months.
Indeed. When we see Cleveland and we hear about these Black nationalists, a name that comes to mind as well is Don Freeman. Could you speak about him and his contribution to the movement and any other organizations he may be a part of?
Yeah, Don Freeman was with another brother who's in the Republic of New Africa, who's no longer with us, our elder, Wilbur Granton, were the backbone of the push for Black nationalism in Cleveland, the hardcore political mind. Don Freeman specifically came from RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. Before there were Afro Set, New Libya, Six Trey, all these other sections of Black nationalists, there was RAM. And RAM existed as educating a lot of these kids before they hit the streets and formed their organizations. Don Freeman was, to put it into, I'm trying to find a way to explain it the best way to kind of simplify it, was really much the backbone, the precursor. RAM was the precursor to the big multiple cultural movement that would happen, and liberation movement that would happen in Cleveland. Don Freeman served as a teacher in John Hay High School, where he educated and recruited most Black students for RAM. And a lot of these students end up leading, like Harlel X, Sababa Akili. Ahmed Evans was technically never a part of RAM, but his colleagues in New Libya, Asu Bey, were a part of RAM. And they had all participated in RAM at some point. Eventually, most people ended up leaving RAM because they wanted to do more work that consisted of interacting with the people and more on the ground work. And that's what Don Freeman set up. Was Don Freeman is one of the reasons most in the 1960s, most of Cleveland were Black nationalists. He kind of set the stage for the nationalist movement, and still is. Of anything, Don Freeman, I met him myself. He's someone who still is a Black nationalist. He never gave up. The elder is, I think, 90 something years old. And he still has not given up on that political line of the right to self-determination in the end of capitalism. He never has given up on that political line at his age. He still has a paper, a magazine that he still drops monthly, or maybe every other month seasonally, on his takes of what's going on in the political world as we speak. So that's a little bit of who Don Freeman was to Cleveland, and he himself as a worker in the movement.
Yes. Interesting. When it comes to Don Freeman, Ram, Afroset, the Republic of New Libya, and the Black Panther Party, as you just said, it's interconnected. So are you saying that Black Panther Party was introduced via Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, and that members drove from Cleveland to California? So are you saying that during this time there was no there was no tribalism, but it seems like everybody was cross-pollinating and influenced by each other, and that there was a mass movement together? Could you explain how more of this came about, and was there any conflict amongst these organizations in Cleveland?
Oh, there was definitely conflict. So basically, Afros, there was never like a large flock of Clevelanders going to California. It was just when Afroset was getting started, most people went to California because they heard of the Black Panther Party and the US organization, where they pulled a lot of their information to bring to Cleveland. So the tribalism between all these groups, you had Afroset and Huff, you had the Republic of New Libya and Glenville, and you had the Black Panther Party, which did not come to effect as an official chapter until the early 70s, that took place off Kinsman. So you had three organizations. And then within these three organizations, you had smaller set groups in these cities, like the Sixth Trade off of, I believe it's Quincy that they stayed off of. And then you had other smaller nationalist groups. You also had the United Federation of Black Nationalists. These groups definitely there was peace among them. I don't want people to get caught up on thinking that these groups did not like each other. Most of the groups got along. It led to a lot of problems with kind of each one of them wanted to be the Black nationalist organization. Afroset was the biggest one in all of Ohio. It was not only in Cleveland, it was also in Akron. It was also, I think they even had a chapter in Columbus. And they were even, before they end up kind of falling apart, they were even going to Newark. It was that big. A lot of the tribalism and problems that came into existence with these groups were a lot of them had a problem with leadership. Now, to give Afroset criticism from the historical context was that Afroset was very close to the mayor at that time, Carl B. Stokes. And at some point, they became after the Glenville Rebellion, they leaned from revolutionary hardcore to being pretty revisionist. They didn't really particulate. So Harlell Jones, which is now we call him, because before he was a nationalist, he was Harlell X. And then he ended up denouncing Black nationalism later in his life and gaining back his European last name, Harlell Jones. The problem came because Afroset became less revolutionary and very revisionist. So Carl Stokes wouldn't mind giving them funding, but the other groups did not receive as much funding to start their programs. So New Libya and Glenville like I said, New Libya and Glenville, Afro Set and Huff, and Black Panther Party and Kinsmen, and different tribal groups already spread out within these areas. But this tribalism wasn't something as big of a deal at this time period. But it didn't come to, I'll say, a bigger climax until the Black Panther Party came in the 70s with Afro Set and the Black Panther Party, the official Black Panther Party that came. The problem became of FBI intrusion on start instigating beef, where the newspaper put out that an Afro Set member killed a Black Panther Party member. And then the news came out. It wasn't for Wilbur Granton, who had pulled all the nationalists and New Africans together and said that, one, the Afro Set member wasn't even a member of Afro Set, and the other guy wasn't even a member of the Black Panther Party. It was something created to create more beef and make them fight amongst each other than it was actually about these two groups existing. The Black Panther Party came, and what made it different than the other groups was they had a Black Marxist, and it wasn't too hardcore, the Shikis, they were the Shikis, but they weren't, as we know, the Black Panther Party, they weren't very much on the cultural nationalism side. They leaned more so on the socialist working class side. So they usually united with the Communist Party in Cleveland and other organizations, At some point, the beef really ends, where I can say it got to a real hardcore problem, is when the police department bombs the Black Panther Party's health clinic, and the Afro Set members help build it up. But it was overall small effects of problems, and a lot of the problems, with all due respect to our elders, came from Harlel X, may he rest in peace, because they had a little bit of a problem with egoism that he had. And then he later denounced Black nationalism, and it made people really distance themselves from Afro Set not Afro Set, because the group organization was the problem, but they more also had a problem with leaderships in Afro Set, if that makes sense.
Indeed. Going more to the culture of the New African Independence Movement and also Black nationalism. Is it true that there is a red, black, and green flag at one point that was placed at the public library in light of this history?
So Cleveland had a different flag than the RNA and the Garvey Pan-Africanist flag. The flag they flung that represented New Libya was black, red, and green, because their priority was the idea of blackness or something like that. It's still, even now, to most elders in Cleveland, it's a big discussion about what flag do we hang, because a lot of the elders are connected to the black, red, and green. Some elders prefer the red, black, and green, and some of us prefer the green, red, and black. So it's, even though like these flags are all interconnected, meaning kind of the same thing, it leads to, I know a lot of elders have a big problem which flag means what and what do we hang. But I don't know about a flag hanging at the library. I know that Cleveland has a flag raising in City Hall for the RBG flag. It's the Pan-Africanist Garvey flag. And I think this year's they had the RNA flag on it. And it's a pretty my personal take on it is a very revisionist take, because City Hall was the main one taking down the Black nationalists and the New African nationalists, and now they're trying to put them on the flyers in City Hall as if they actually cared about them when they did it.
Could we go into the furtherness of what happened with Ahmaud Evans and on that fateful day? I've heard some things that it was police agitation, that many of the projects of Afro Set, the businesses, were being shut down, and that there was some, coercive tactics. Do you have any history of that night and what happened to the house and the members that were there?
Yeah, it's a story that's always told, by the elders. So what happened so context. New Libya was extremely at this point in when they were at their prime before FBI intervention, the most militant black organization in Cleveland by far. They were, they would often have problems with the police at their shop off of 111th and Superior. Um, and that's, at some point, the police department shuts it down because of sanitary reasons. It's important to know that Ahmed was also a businessman. He didn't want black people to work. He felt like we worked enough and was a fan of entrepreneurship and people not working. So when his business was shut down, that was a vital blow because not only was that a place where they organized that, it was also a place where Ahmed made his ends meet. So at this point, when they shut down the shop, they also are trying to evict him from his home. They're not only him, but they're also evicting other New Libya members. They're trying to basically get rid of the Republic of New Libya. And at this time, they've already received the Cleveland Now funds. And now with the Cleveland Now funds, they buy so much I think they buy so many guns, they're stockpiling weapons in their apartment. They've already went to Detroit, um, Pittsburgh, New York, and Akron to discuss a big rebellion to happen in that year. They wanted to have one big rebellion so that when it popped off in every city, not just Cleveland. It didn't end up working like that, but that's what the plan was. So at this point, once they get back to Cleveland, they're now guarding the apartment from the eviction. They have shotguns. They're outside publicly guarding the apartment. And then the Cleveland Police Department puts 2 patrol cop cars in front of the apartment. One of the councilmen, if I could remember his name, and community organizer, they pick up a member from AfroSet to talk to Ahmed because they want him to quell down, to put in some term. And at some point, he says, tell the man upstairs, Carl Stokes, everything's going to be okay. Later that night, we don't know till this day who shot first. One of the New Libya members is shot dead by a police officer. He shot, I think, 2 times in his arm, 3 times in his leg. He bleeds out due to the ambulance they didn't allow the ambulance to come save him. So he bleeds out. That leads to Ahmed and other New Libyan members engaging into a shootout. Ahmed shoots his gun once, his gun jams. And then the other members come into effect, into basically, at this point, it's important to note that these New Libyan members were 16, 21, and 15, around that age. They were really young, and they were out shooting the police department. Asu Bey, our elder Asu Bey, was in the apartment, and I think he had a .22 rifle, and they said he was hitting those windows so hard they thought there was multiple shooters in the apartment. Nandu Bey, while he was climbing up, was also, I think he was at the corner store when the shootout began. And when he comes back from the corner store while the shootout's happening, his little brother, little Nandu, is wounded on the ground. His last words were Allahu Akbar. And Nandu, his older brother, picks up his little brother's rifle and begins the shootout, and begins also to shoot out. This is leading to, I think, about 6 cops die that night, and 3 New Libya members died that night. And while this is also happening, let's pull it even further back from the shootout in New Libya and how big Cleveland's nationalists were. At this point, AfroSet is now getting the word that the rebellion is happening. Or as they had said at that time, the top popped off the lid. It's what they would use as a code word. It's a little obvious, but it was a code term at that time. And that's when By the time Sababa Akili finds out about the rebellion, he gets to the office, and he says there's about almost 100 something teenagers with guns ready to basically go to war. And right before they head out and talk about diversion tactics, the police department throws smoke bombs into the facility, and it causes everyone in the shop to scatter. It's important to note that there was also another Black Panther Party in Cleveland office appeared, not officialized, but they were a Black Panther Party. And that's when they began to burn down all of Glenville. I think now it's $1.3 million in damage to Glenville. If you go through Glenville now, you can still see some of the empty lots from the burnt buildings of the riots in the 1968. And they tear down Ahmed's apartment building. It now sits on an empty lot to this day. Some white dude owns it right now. People are talking about trying to get it back and put a plaque there for the nationalists. But that's basically what happened that night. I wish I could go into a little bit more details, but I don't know it off the top of my head, sadly.
Nah, that's cool, brother. That's cool. All right. Now, the area of Cleveland, it being up north in Ohio, many people would think that this was a place where New African Black people could, experience a better life than the South. I've heard reports of overt racism in Ohio, as well as starch racism of literally neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan affiliated police officers. I've even heard over and seen in the news in the recent years, past years, that it has now been, a law has been passed for these officers in Ohio to have a GED or high school a high school diploma or a high school equivalent GED, etc. Do you know anything about this, and how is police repression in Ohio?
Police repression in Ohio. So the first thing you asked me was a better place for Clevelanders. My a better place for Black New Africans to come north in Cleveland. My great grandfather was from Jackson, Mississippi, and he moved from Jackson, Mississippi to Cleveland after the lynching of Emmett Till. And when Black people arrived at Cleveland, they particularly went to Huff. That was the Black area. That's where all Black people, the first generation of the first migration, lived, was Huff. And then Glenville was a white area, and then slowly became, as the Black population increased, a Black area. Same thing with Kinsman and Lee and Harvard. All those areas became Black as the Black population in Cleveland grew. But specifically, it was Huff, Glenville, East Cleveland, and then Kinsman. The road of Kinsman itself became Black. So the police department was always brutal in Cleveland. I remember at 16 years old, my house was swatted by the police department in Cleveland, with like shotguns, AKs, the whole shindig. And it was all because of a false report. It was all claimed to be by a false report, where they raided everyone on my apartment floors apartment. They raided the whole thing. Cleveland's police department, specifically, let's get to Ohio. Ohio itself is predominantly white. Outside of Cleveland, is predominantly white. In small parts, like I said, Dayton and whatnot. But outside Northeast Ohio, it's a rural white Nazi-filled area. Springfield, Ohio should be one of the main examples right now, because most white nationalists right now are fleeing to Springfield, Ohio, because of the Trump statements on Haitians. I don't know much about the GED or the high school diploma law I know it was passed, but it was passed because I know Cleveland is desperate for more police officers. Particularly, they have a thing of more than $1 million funding, and they go through this whole area. They don't even clean up no crime. They don't do anything but harass people. I remember it was recently on the footage. They were beating up a 16-year-old kid. You know what I mean? Um, and he was proud of it, talking to this, this little man like he was nothing. You know what I mean? I can't give you like any details on like specifically on like any statistic numbers, but I will tell you like Cleveland Police Department is probably the worst department in Northeast Ohio. They even admitted to the Cleveland people earlier this year that their whole job is to be reactionary. They'll come after something happens. They will not be there before something happens. They've I think I don't know one person in Cleveland that does not have a horror story from the Cleveland Police Department.
Another thing with Cleveland that we have, like you said, that the police admitted to being reactionary. Ohio has the highest number of human trafficking reports within that area. I can't remember the name that it was branded for this area, some type of railroad, something like that. But what is the community response to the sexual exploitation and to the human trafficking of minors and adults, men and women alike?
That's a good question. That's like a really big problem in Cleveland. So the reason sex trafficking is so easy in Ohio is because Ohio's filled, especially Northeast Cleveland, like Northeast Ohio, is literally filled with highways. If you were to grab someone off the street and just jump on the highway, you could be on your way to Newark, Chicago. They would have no idea. The community's reaction to this is almost, there's a brother missing now that we still have no idea. He's been missing for over a year, named Keyshawn Williams. And he's been missing for, literally over a year, where we've had search parties all through East Cleveland looking for him. The community's reaction to it, at least I can only speak for the mother and father, is that it's been really scary to sit, especially in East Cleveland or in Huff and Glenville, or even Kinsman, or even where I grew up in what would be called like the ghetto suburbs in Warrensville, further up the way, where you would get the kids will come up missing. Is that where parents have now went the extra length to make sure they take their kids to wherever they need to be. Keyshawn Williams, the young brother who's been missing. Like last time people seen him was that he was leaving apparently a block party, and no one, not even his friends, no one apparently knows where he went. You know what I mean? No one knows if he went home. No one knows if he went to a friend's. No one knows. And and these kids, these not even adults. These are kids missing. You know what I mean? These aren't even the women that they're abducting aren't even over the age of 18. They're like 16 and missing. You know what I mean? They're 14, 13 and missing. I know that one organization takes a lot of the priority of when a child was either a runaway. New Era Cleveland did take that up at that time period in what year was this? 2017, 18, and 19, where they went into the streets and were pretty hard on looking for children that went missing. But then again, one organization looking for the amount of children missing is absurd. A lot of it, in my opinion, to be honest with you, is a lot of it has to do with the businesses that aren't Black in these areas, like the Arabs and these things like that. Like they more than likely know what's going on and they don't say anything. I know that at some point and a while ago, I'm gonna say 2 years ago, it was footage of that Arab was talking to a 16-year-old girl, I won't point that he's Arab, but he was somebody not black in the community that ran a liquor store or a corner store or a convenience store. And they seen him trying to talk to a 16-year-old girl, and business eventually got shut down. But nevertheless, it kind of led the line of a lot of things that are happening is a little bit more external than it is internal, if that makes sense. A lot of these people aren't even from Cleveland, taking girls from Cleveland.
Indeed. To go over that and kind of highlight some points that I've acquired from Cleveland, there has been numerous amount of abandoned buildings, abandoned schools. I was given some reports in the past, specifically according to a old art college, I believe it was, that was turned into an apartment. But some of these buildings have also been used to hold house parties, kickbacks, house parties, little speakeasies, and raves. Do you know if these areas also being used to kidnap, human traffic, etc.? Is there any truth to this?
I'm pretty sure it's true. So I did a lot of housing before I even became a new African nationalist. I did a lot of housing work in Cleveland against gentrification. Cleveland's housing problem is probably like when even back to the 1960s when Dr. King visited Cleveland, and I believe this was his last visit in 60. I want to say 67 or 66. Where he says Cleveland's in the worst condition than he's seen across America. That's particularly because of the housing. The housing is really bad. And there's a bunch of abandoned buildings in East Cleveland where East Cleveland technically is not a part of the city of Cleveland. It has its own mayor, it has its own everything. And it's still like the amount of corruption in East Cleveland leads Cleveland to have a hill of abandoned buildings. Even going back to a lot of these abandoned buildings, going as far back to, like I said, the Glenville and Huff rebellions, where where they still around, or even the abandoned homes that refuse to get tore down, that just sit there right next to functioning homes, collecting dust and drug dealers, in those homes, where they turn into a trap and they go into that house and they turn into where they have parties and whatnot. Even my fiance's friend was found in one of these abandoned homes where they would sell dope. The housing problem in Cleveland originates from, in my opinion, and one European American wrote a really good paper from Case Western that I wish I would share with you guys on gentrification, Black rebellion, and I think revolution. I'm paraphrasing the title. But he wrote it while he was in college. And it's a really good reading that the reason Huff, Glenville, and East Cleveland are under franchise and things like that is literally because they dared to rebel in the 60s. And now they don't receive funding. And when they do receive funding like Huff and Glenville, there's going to be gentrified. It's not to be reclaim any cultural habitants within those areas. So it leads that area to be searched around with no jobs already, because wherever there was, the reason Black people lived in those areas because there was work in factories in those areas. Those factories are gone now. So at least most people from East Cleveland have to travel further up the way to like Solon to find jobs and find work because East Cleveland has no jobs in East Cleveland. They tried at one point to set up a cooperative called Evergreen, and Evergreen paid people below minimum wage and didn't even pay the workers enough to even live. I think even now they pay $12 an hour. That's not enough to live off even in Cleveland, although a smaller Rust Belt city. So to get to your point, yeah, it's all tied to like the sex trafficking because those areas are they're actually under police. They're not as hard. They're hardly policed at all, especially East Cleveland. East Cleveland's police department is, I think, 5 police officers. And Glenville and Huff also are patrolled by the Cleveland Police Department. Now they're actually over patrolled because Huff is not just monitored by the Cleveland Police Department. You also have Case Western College and Cleveland State University who have their own police department. But you don't just have two police departments now. You also have Cleveland Clinic Police Department that also patrols that area. So you have over policing and then non-policing in some parts of the city that lead to like very hardcore crime in those areas and police brutality as well. If that answers your question. I don't know if that answers.
Nah, you good, brother. You good. You kind of you hitting on something. Uh, with this under policing in these abandoned buildings and these problem areas, and people are not, they're having to go far away or go some random place or just stay where they are due to not being able to find suitable housing and suitable jobs. I hear that not only is there a lot of crime, a need for security, but in a way, it allows people who are not from that community and who are not New Africans or Black people to profit off of these people. What do you see in these communities as far as who has the jobs? Is there security? Is the security suitable? And what is it like living in Cleveland in this day and age?
I say to live in Cleveland this day and age now is pretty like I say most people my age want to leave Cleveland. You know, Cleveland's crime the Cleveland's tribal street gangs aren't even really like people don't really gang bang in Cleveland to say like people throw up blood or crip and like do things like that. More so the violence that happens within the New African community comes from literally just repping a hood. You know, they rep, for example, like Huff Harlemites, and then you got the Heartless Felons. Most of them are now in prison. But each person now just reps wherever street they're from, and most of these streets are like literally around the corner from each other. So like most of the violence that happens, especially because they're like the people that die in Cleveland, people die in Cleveland every day to gun violence. They're like 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Like they're young. They're not usually older, you know. They're like just legal if they when they're died to the violence. So I feel like to live in Cleveland now with the under policing, over policing in some areas, the housing issue, it leads most people to want to leave Cleveland, which is what Cleveland is seeing now is depletion of their population, where most people from, especially New Africans from Cleveland, leave Cleveland. If anything, from what I spoke to most of my friends now, they actually want to go back to the territory of the South. But it's for a reactionary reason that they don't particularly see themselves as actually getting involved in solving some of the issues that we face in Cleveland. They think once the issues that exist in Cleveland don't also exist within the South, which isn't true. So what I'm seeing from a lot of these different things is the depletion of the New African population in Cleveland. Even though Cleveland's Black population is humongous, it's still a slowly depleting one at that, where most of them want to leave Cleveland. And the ones that, you know, most of them want to leave Cleveland. And the ones that stay, you know, stay more so by the choice of that they feel like they have some form of opportunity here. And it's up to a lot of organizers, Black organizers, to find ways to kind of recuperate a Black liberation movement that we had previously. Is also another bigger problem is that there's not a big Black movement in Cleveland like there was in the 60s. Most, you know, I talked to a comrade. She had told me that, like, you know, it feels like Black people really don't want to fight anymore. It's also what makes Cleveland also more interesting, a little bit more interesting in the situation. Unlike Chicago and Detroit kind of have a culture going on that makes them Chicago and Detroit versus Cleveland, which has like a semi culture. It's not really more so like it's not really a strong culture that ties us together. Which is why we have so much tribalism, even going back to the 1960s and the liberation movement, where even though Clevelanders see themselves as much bigger, like it's Cleveland versus the world to this day, but it's still, we don't see each other as good company. So right now, what I'm trying to do, and a lot of other organizers, myself, Black New African organizers, trying to do, is trying to recuperate a Black liberation movement that, one, gives the Black people in Cleveland a bigger hope in solving these issues versus running away from them, and finding more solutions and strategic goals to help the youth get away from the violence that surrounds their community, with programs. And that's what's been being done now, is these programs are being built up. It's slow, but surely getting done, because there's also, we have a much bigger than the New African movement is the Palestinian movement, which is triggering, by cause effect, more Black people to get involved in the movement, by just being around, most of them being younger and surrounded by, in college, surrounded by more Palestinians, because we also have a really large Palestinian population in Cleveland. So living in Cleveland, I'm seeing a depleting population, but I'm also seeing more organizers join the movement to some capacity, whether they're New African nationalists, Pan-Africanists, or just vaguely pro-Black, join the movement to build something bigger than themselves in Cleveland, because Cleveland right now has no big movement, which leads to a lower self-esteem within the New African community, in my opinion.
Excellent answer. To kind of reroute back to also the what we will call the Black flight from Cleveland, and also the abandoned lots and abandoned buildings. I hear that there is a program, or at least was, that was also started due to it being so many abandoned lots. But there's a program that was encouraging people to enter a government program to get a hold of these abandoned lots. And that, unfortunately, due to this problem of not only, I can't remember the exact number, but it's so many acres of abandoned area in the city of Cleveland. But this area is now, not only due to gentrification, but there's a disproportionate amount of those that are native to this city being able to get this land that the city is issuing out, and that there are outside investors capitalizing on this issue and snatching up a lot of the land just to let it sit. Is this true?
That's 104% true. The place I'm renting and living at now is not owned by someone from Cleveland. They're usually are from New York or Arizona. They're not from here. Most of the apartment buildings in Huff, Glenville, East Cleveland are not owned by people from Cleveland. And when one of the campaigns we did, when I was part of the Greater Cleveland Housing Collective, Great Cleveland Housing Collective, which was a leftist organizing space to help form tenant unions for Black tenants, was that, for example, the biggest one was Euclid Estates, where the owner was not from Cleveland, and he literally he was a slumlord. He had an apartment building, and the apartment building was so bad, if you were to walk in it, you would smell mold and mold, and you would smell mold and urine and feces. It was that disgusting. And at some point, some of these slumlords in Cleveland would get dope dealers to push other tenants out of their home. They would have people come and bang on doors and rob them so they would move from certain areas. So Cleveland particularly is also, like, the government itself is in on it, because the thing is, the Cleveland government is puppeted by bigger enterprise companies outside of Cleveland. So Clevelanders, even white, New African, Palestinian, whatever, don't even benefit from a lot of the things that were happening because they were only looking out for the profit margin of making Cleveland step away from being like Detroit to make it become like a fancy city when it was never that. And the way they did that was by harassing the New African community, was giving away the land from people from non-Clevelanders to people in New York, Arizona, California, not from Cleveland. And they would literally have the land sit there, do nothing with it. Or if they had an apartment building or something like that, they would do nothing to help actually the tenants, or they'll lease it, but they won't actually do work to fix or keep up with the apartment. And this is the upteen time this had happened. And there's not even that is another good example. Oh my God, why can I think of the name of this park? But it was kind of a trailer park with New Africans and Europeans as well. That sat right next to the Lake Erie. They basically kicked all of them off of where they lived for years. They wanted to tear it down. It was only it had to be maybe 1 acre of land, maybe a few more. I can't remember the specific number, but they kicked them all off so they could build a park there. It removed a whole group of people. Like Cleveland's biggest problem is, it kind of comes back to Malcolm X, revolution relies on land, is that Cleveland, even from we were talking about New Libya, was about preserving particularly the Black area, the Black ghetto, and keeping it to where Black people controlled it. Although they confused it with Black nationalism, like I think Gjgrc hit it on the nail when I was rereading Stand Up Struggle 4, where Black nationalism suddenly just meant having control of your community. But they believed that they were going to take control of the ghetto and make it sovereign, which was one mistake, yes, but it came from the ideas of the problems that you had just mentioned of not having control at all of the ghetto in Cleveland, where you were removed from the ghetto and put into another one, or you were just forced to move any area wherever the profit margin required you to move, wherever capital made you move. And that's all that happens in Cleveland is the profit margin, particularly like in East Cleveland, Huffington, makes you have to move.
Also going to the lack of control, not just of the land and the infrastructure, but we also go into the excessive, what would it be, food deserts and food swamps in Cleveland?
Yeah, that's like in East Cleveland. So there's no grocery stores in East Cleveland. It led to having a food desert. So the Nation of Islam was trying to, they had something called the Superior Renaissance. Remember the street Superior, because Superior is also where New Libya had their organization off of. And the Nation of Islam particularly floated to Superior because that's also where they had history. Like I think the Nation of Islam even owned I believe a theater off of Superior at some point. Like Superior was filled with just Nation of Islam and nationalists. The food desert exists because there's no grocery stores within East Cleveland, basically, and then it leads to like Black people having to travel much further out to go grocery shopping, or some people even having no choice but to grocery shop at like Dollar General, like it's a grocery store. I found out recently from someone who was a manager who worked at Dollar General for years, was that like Dollar General purposely picks certain areas where there's a food desert because they want people to go there as if they're grocery shopping and they make more profit off of that. And that's what a lot is happening in the East Cleveland, is that there isn't that many grocery stores. So people have to go further out for food. I know people have been trying to find, a lot of the organization, like I said, has been trying and build up the funds, specifically the Nation of Islam, trying to build up the funds. So shout out to them, at least in Cleveland off of Superior, to build a grocery store off in Superior for the neighborhood.
So in light of all of these things happening in New Libya, where we see a cultural renaissance, a cultural revolution at its height in the 60s and 70s, being utterly repressed by really Gestapo cops and invisible empire, Klansmen dressed in blue uniforms and shiny badges. As we see in the past, what happened and the effects are still here today. What are some techniques or what are some words that you would like to say for the community to struggle for? Yes, sir.
Well, with all that happened in New Libya, like the main thing I want people, the new African community to know is that the strategic tactic is to organize. Like I feel like that's the main thing is that I feel like a lot of it's so bad is that it's easy to incorporate defeatism or to have the idea that maybe I as an individual can make it and then leave the hood. And that's what like I've seen indoctrinated often in East Cleveland and Huffing Glenville and any new African community in Cleveland is to either leave or that no matter how much we do one thing, it won't work. Like for example, like one thing I'm doing with my fiance and I are doing is trying to set up a student union, a Black student union in Cuyahoga Community College, which is also one of the more popular community colleges in the country. Is that Cuyahoga Community College was specifically had a lot of history because most nationalists went to Tri-C, is what it was called. Most nationalists went to Tri-C and they formed organizations in Tri-C or joined from Tri-C. Most Panthers in Cleveland were attending Tri-C. Cleveland State and Case Western were pretty white bourgeois and just got integrated, but Tri-C was pretty more famous within the new African community because it was a community college. One, it was more affordable, and two, it wasn't segregated. Black people were allowed to go there. Is that one thing I'm seeing that I've been observing as a tactic is reaching a lot more student organizers and getting the students involved in street organizing, rather than getting more involved into political awareness. I've seen that the Black Student Union at Cleveland State is not involved in any political action whatsoever. They've more so involved themselves in partying and celebrating Blackness, wherever that means, without struggling for the continuous genocide that we're facing today. So my main thing right now, my main tactic, my main thing to give to new Africans is it's not to sound cliche, but it's to stay woke, stay conscious, and stay on your toes and stay active in the Black community to solve the problem. Do not separate the problems that happen in our community from yourself. Get involved in solving them so that we can find a solution to a problem that had been existing since we left the territory.
The question comes up a lot. As we can see in this new era, there's a lot of people using Mao, communism, Marx, Lenin, using it as their main ideology. New African Maoists or New African communists, New African, all of these terms as it relates to, the Russian struggle or the Chinese struggle. My question for you is, what do you feel about the import of this ideology as the main ideology in this current time for New Africans?
In my personal opinion, and what I've read is that New African nationalism is an ideology within itself, and most New Africans. I'm not more so focused on New Africans who are like New African nationalists. They're also socialists or communists or anarchists. Because to be honest with you, from the start of the RNA, most people had different takes of what the RNA would look like. Even though the PGRNA had the idea, most individuals still chose different routes of political ideas and concepts. Now, if we're talking about specifically Black people who choose to only be communist, then yeah, there's a problem with that because they now indoctrinate themselves and what I would call settler Marxism or settler communism. The idea that America is a territory that has a class is a very much of a class reductionist version of like an integrated America without solving the land back question for natives and the question of self-determination for the new African. And they refuse to kind of dance around the problem of that and just say, we semi-embrace that, we semi-embrace this, but they don't actually adapt, especially as Black people. They don't adapt themselves to the work of what happens specifically in the Black area. They see it as a bigger working class struggle, which it is a part of a bigger working class struggle. But the new African communities' class interests have always been, to me, overlooked by the communists, anarchists for the European Americans' working class interest. For example, I think Harry Haywood, who was a new African nationalist, he kind of was the main person who pushed that within the communists, within the Euro-American communists, in which he did do successfully at some point. But he dropped the African Blood Brotherhood, so integrated into the Communist Party USA, just so the Communist Party USA can kick him out and then drop the idea of self-determination. And then to me, we reach a contradiction where we talk about self-determination and then rely on the white working class for the ideas of what a revolution is. To me, the new African revolution can exist with or without the white working class. We've made it this far, to be honest, without the white working class. And that the revolutionary struggle is tied to internationally to the oppressed people around the world. But the push of New African nationalism has to happen within New Africans themselves and New African communities. No matter if you consider yourself a communist, white people who even embrace the Black Belt theory or New African nationalism, to me, they embrace it sometimes with good faith, but they themselves cannot do nation building for a group of people they are not a part of. But to bring it back to your question on New African communist, New African this, if you're saying New African nationalism, and I'm saying I'm a New African nationalist communist, or New African nationalist socialist, New African nationalist anarchist, New African nationalist this, New African that, I mean, you're kind of like, it kind of goes into kind of the political clarity of the 60s was that, to me historically looking at from what I've always read, was that there was no real political clarity of what a Republic of New Africa would look like, even though there was the what's it called? Oh man, I was just reading it. Oh my god, I want to call it Umoja Code, but I may have butchered that. Either way, they still had different adaptations of what that was. To me, it's just saying socialism, the idea of not privatization and collective thought. But to some people, they choose kind of do a different route where they think, oh, we should call it the Umoja Code. Oh, it's not really socialism because Marx got the ideas of socialism from new African communities, from African communities that were already practicing communalism. It's like, it's the same thing. I feel like we're bickering backwards about the same thing where we're saying the exact same thing. Like, we're against ideas of privatization. You know what I mean? And that's, to me, where the line should be drawn, is anti-capitalism. I don't think like it's that important to where someone can be a new African communist, socialist. As long as you're a new African nationalist and you're anti-capitalist, I don't particularly care. In my opinion, my take, if that answers what you were trying to say. And for people who are Black, claim to just only be communists but don't embrace new African nationalism or even Pan-Africanism, they particularly, to me, remove themselves from prioritizing the Black struggle that they have responsibility to be a part of, in my opinion, if that answers your question.
A detailed question that I have for you, extremely detailed from your perspective, from your opinion. What is a New African revolutionary nationalist? New African revolutionary nationalist, not just a New African nationalist, a New African revolutionary nationalist.
A revolutionary New African nationalist is someone who adapts the ideas of self-determination adapted by our elders of the New African Revolution. I'm going to Wilbur Grant and Amaro Bedeli, Giadio Bedeli. Who else? What's that brother's name? Again, I was just reading the New African Theoretical Journals and things like that, and particularly adapts those ideologies and forms a New African nationalist, a revolutionary New African nationalist. And that's what my take is that particularly the person who adapts that ideology and fights for the self-determination within the Southern Territory.
Can you give us more tips on community building?
My main point tip is that to do survival programs. I feel like most Black people are in need of more things to help them survive within the Black community. Like when we first organized, we did a coat drive, and that pulled in like so many people from the area to actually gain trust and things like that, where people trusted you because you were helping them provide something. Survival programs to me gives the community the trust in you to help solve a problem. To me, that's like the number one way. And then when you gain that trust, you start holding events, more radical events on the problems within the community where they learn something, and you're slowly building not just political line within these people. You're also gaining the trust for them to actually trust each other at these events. So, like in my experience, organizing for only about 3 years now. No, oh my God, I think it's about to be 4. Is that within that time is to actually start doing things that actually personally benefits these people, their material needs, helps them a lot more, and gains the trust. And then once you gain their trust with the material need, they show up to actual events that you host in that community. And then that builds a better community trust with not just you as an organization, but with even the people who are already meeting there at that time.
I'd like to thank you for coming on here, comrade. We most definitely want to stay in touch. You're already in the group. Let's do collective work and responsibility with one another. Let's set up autonomous infrastructures together. Let's push this new African revolutionary nationalism. Let's push this education. Let's really work with each other and influence each other to do the right thing and keep us riled up, because we're in an era right now, in a time where it's just easy to quit, like you say, and worry about yourself, man. It's like super beneficial for people just to do that, and a lot of people do that. A lot of people get burnt out, like what me and you talked about, comrade. And there's so many bad elements in this movement. It's crazy. It's an honor for y'all guys to still be in it. It's an honor for people to still fight this fight at this time psychologically. I mean, we haven't even got the chance to fight the enemy yet, to be honest with you. We're too busy fighting with one another, fighting over ideology, fighting over shit that don't even really matter, to be honest with you. That's extremely petty and politically immature. That's causing great stagnation with people with entitlement, egoism, and once again, lack of education, lack of ideology, lack of a political line where our people is going. So I would like to use this dialogue to teach people, teach cadre, to inform people, to influence people to do better and work with one another. And that's another reason why you're on here, comrade. You're with the Rebuild Collective. You're with the Republic of New Libya. George Jackson Grassroots Collective is on here, and we're working together. We're trying to figure it out together. And then people need to see more of that and be influenced by that. So I'd like to salute to you, comrade. I just want to say free the land.
Free land. It's always good to talk to comrades, even that where I feel like I'm losing my enthusiasm, talking to other comrades, definitely reinforces, why you're here, and that you're not alone in this struggle, I appreciate you inviting me on here. I definitely will stay in touch. Free the land by any means necessary.
And we will do a checkup. These dialogues are just not one and dones. You know what I mean? It's a dialogue. We keep it. We going. If we got anything else going on, we could do some events together, collaborate, do whatever we could do together. Let's figure it out, because 2025 is just going to be crazy, comrades. And we got to get educated, and we got to see who's who, and we got to develop our revolutionary consciousness and strategy to win this war, this low intensity war, this psychological war. I mean, it's crazy right now. So let's build the win.